Today I would like to talk about what I'm actually observing at the moment. So I want to put into words what I'm experiencing while I'm sitting here looking out of the window at the castle and the park. I just want to make an observation of what's going on in my consciousness, and through that to define what consciousness is in terms of memory, thought, and knowledge and experience. So when I got up in the morning, I made breakfast and I listened to a quartet by Beethoven, played by the Amadeus Quartet. So at the moment I'm listening only to quartets from the classical period. Classical period began with Joseph Haydn in around 1775, and it more or less ended in about 1820 or 30 with the death of Beethoven. So you have in the classical period Joseph Haydn, Amadeus Mozart, Ludwig von Beethoven, Schubert and Schumann. They were the main 5 classical composers. And so for the last 8 months I've been listening only to their quartets. That's the only music I listen to. I don't listen to the radio, I don't have a television. So really, you might say my only form of entertainment is listening to these quartets. And all through my life, I've always wanted to focus on the quartets, but I never collected records, so I was never in a position to actually listen to them. So now that I have a computer and I can access the music on YouTube, so that's what I listen to. And the feeling I get from the quartets is what I've always liked. I like the piano as well, but the quartet resonates a certain kind of energy and feeling that suits me. I don't quite know why, but it's I would say there's a sense of gravitas, a sense of seriousness within the quartet medium, although it can be quite light and very pleasurable. It can be very somber and melancholic, and I wouldn't say that it's particularly introspective. I don't think, for me personally, the feeling level has a good balance with the intellectual level. So you might say feeling and thought move together in one's consciousness, and it's a kind of balance. I think there's a kind of integrity, because if you think of the quartet, the 4 movements of the quartet, well, in symbolism, the quartet 4 is integration and then that would be the square, and then when you put a circle around the square, then that's wholeness. So you have a kind of integration, and when you're listening to it, you could listen with a sense of wholeness. That's kind of how I feel. It's a sense of completion. It's a sense of fulfillment. It's a sense of order. So it's a kind of balance, a sense of order. There is a sense of depth, but it's not necessarily going inside, as it were, in the kind of introspection. So anyway, I have breakfast, listen to the music, and eventually I go out for a walk for a couple of hours around 11 to 1 down by the river, and that's a daily thing. So I keep myself fit in that way. And I come back, and then I'm making these videos in the afternoon. And then I spend the rest of the day sitting quiet, and I might watch a video if I want to. I've been watching videos of Krishnamurti, David Bohm, various so-called spiritual teachers in Advaita, Non-Duality. So I'm kind of getting into meditation. I'm getting into the more objective side to spirituality, and the more mystical side, metaphysical side, which I haven't done for a long time because I've been preoccupied with writing about symbols and archetypes and mythology. That's what's been occupying me for years. Now I'm focusing on my own awareness of the spiritual, my own awareness of enlightenment, which has been with me for 50 years. So as I sit here and as I'm talking, when I'm talking, I'm not thinking. When I'm talking now, I don't have an agenda. I don't have any preconceived idea of what I'm talking about. I'm just simply observing what I'm doing right now. That's what I'm actually doing. So I'm sitting here. I don't have a sense of anything interior. So there's no, what you might call unconscious. There's no subconscious. There's no background. I'm just sitting here looking out of the window, speaking, and I have no sense of a interior sense of consciousness. So if you think of consciousness and memory and thinking and feeling, I don't have any sense of that at all. So I'm sitting quietly here talking, looking out of the window, and that's all. That's actually all that's going on. So in that silence, I'm self-aware, and I call that state of self-awareness the One, which is a form of emptiness, which is a form of enlightenment. And when I use these terms like silence, enlightenment, the One, or even God, although the language is loaded with religious meaning, that isn't how I experience myself. I don't need to have that language. I don't need to represent myself with that language. I'm just an ordinary person. I'm not known by anybody other than my friend and my nephews. I don't know anybody. I have made interviews and I'm making these videos, but I'm not really known by anybody. And if I talk about being enlightened. I'm just saying that as a very ordinary fact. I'm not making a big deal of it. I mean, it sounds like a big deal if you talk about the One and God, but it isn't really like that for me. That's not how I see it. In fact, the whole spiritual context is very, very simple, because as I sit here, the spiritual fact of the One, the spiritual fact of the silence, the emptiness, the openness, is just a simple fact. Just like looking out of the window, it's as simple as that. But in the literature, when you hear Krishnamurti, David Bohm talking, when you hear other people talking, you look in certain of the Buddhist literature, etc. It's a very complicated, complex process of self-knowledge, which is used in order to arrive at some kind of insight into consciousness, and that insight is seen to come from an objective mind, a form of intelligence that's spiritual, and Krishnamurti refers to that as cosmic consciousness, universal mind, etc. Now, I've never done any of that process. I've never practiced anything. I'm not analytical. I don't analyze my thoughts. I don't focus on my thoughts. I don't focus on the idea of the observer, the observed. I don't do any of that. I don't do anything technical. So as I'm sitting here, the idea that I would look at my thought, that I would look at my memory, that I'd look at knowledge, has no meaning to me. Yes, of course, language is knowledge. My memory is how I talk. Obviously, it's coming from my memory, and the words are conditioned by my memory and the books I've read. But I never think of any of that process in any psychological, philosophical, or religious language. So the Buddhists, they go through all these procedures of observing their consciousness, observing their thoughts, in order to gain an insight into consciousness and hopefully to stop thought. That's the basic Buddhist idea that Krishnamurti uses. The whole idea in meditation is to stop thought. I've never done anything like that. I've never practiced any meditation. I've never psychoanalyzed myself. I don't analyze my consciousness. I don't analyze myself. I don't analyze my personality. But that doesn't mean to say, having read books, that I haven't thought about things. When you read a book, you reflect on it, you think about it. But when I think about it, if I read a book by Carl Jung, for example, and he talks about the psychology of the unconscious, and he talks about the psyche, and he talks about the functions of consciousness, and various things like that. When I read it, I understand it, or I don't understand it, but I don't do anything with it. I don't practice anything. I don't try to do what he did. I just read something. As I say, I either understand it or not, but I don't worry about it. I don't worry about what Krishnamurti says. I don't worry about what anybody says. And so, in a way, I regard all of these people that systematize knowledge in some kind of method or technique of observing yourself. I don't do that. I ignore that. I don't need to do that. I don't want to do that. So, what's going on inside me right now is going on inside everybody. And when I meet people, I talk to them. I don't try to do anything. And if my friend comes to visit me and he teaches psychoanalysis, he teaches Jungian psychology, he's educated in religion, in the classics, Greek mythology, he's very well read in literature, poetry, he got a classics degree from Oxford University. So he's a very intelligent European scholar and a friend of 30 years. But to me, he's an ordinary person, and I talk to him. I don't analyse him. I don't think about what I'm saying to him. I just talk to him. I'm not thinking of myself as being enlightened or not enlightened, or that I have a particular agenda, or that I have a special language I use, like Krishnamurti and the Buddhists. I don't use any special language. I don't have any special concepts. I don't have any way of knowing another person or knowing myself. So to me, I treat other people in a very ordinary way. Now, when I'm talking now in a very specific way about my condition, then I will use particular language that I feel expresses or explains how I feel and think about myself in terms of a spiritual understanding. So, from a spiritual perspective, if somebody came to visit me and they'd read my books and they'd watched my videos or whatever, and they came to visit me and they came into the room, obviously there's expectations because they know about you, you know, they know your work, and they may have ideas of what state you're in, what state of mind you're in, what's behind what you said, and am I in contact with certain energies or certain objective states, like the One, Enlightenment, God, the Self, all of these things. Now, yes, I've used all of those things in my talks and writings, but as a person in everyday life, none of that matters to me. None of that matters to me in relationship to other people. So it doesn't matter to me whether people know me or not. And certainly when I go around where I'm living and meeting people, ordinary people where I'm living, they know nothing about me. And I don't wish them to know anything about me, and I don't wish to be seen in any special light. When I talk about the spiritual in an objective way, so that means a special emphasis on the One, on emptiness, enlightenment, nirvana, Satori, samadhi, all those labels that say there is this special kind of mind, what the Tibetan Buddhists call the one mind. Now, the one mind is a fact for me as I sit here, right? So it's just a normal, natural fact that happened to me at the age of 23, 50 years ago. Now that fact has been with me for 50 years. Very few people know about that fact. So I'm saying now on the video that it's just a simple fact of my life as an ordinary person, with no reputation, or anything like that, just an ordinary person. I'm saying that fact, that spiritual fact, is all about being here now. It's not about another dimension, it's not about life after death, it's not about reincarnation, it's not about whether I know or not that there's other dimensions and nirvana in some transcendental state. I don't know anything about other than sitting here experiencing or being aware of emptiness, nirvana, and that emptiness, that perceptual, spiritual perception, holistic perception of emptiness is right here now and is no different in a sense than my eyes seeing the buildings. So my eyes see the buildings, I'm using my consciousness, my language to communicate, that's very natural, and I'm aware of this emptiness, and that's natural. So it's a totally natural view of the spiritual. So you have the spirit, the psyche, and the body, and they're all one thing. So I'm just sitting here, one person, and that's one thing. They all work together, they're all, you might say, seamlessly working together. Now, I'm not doing anything but talking. So when I'm looking out, all three levels are working together, and I'm not doing anything, I'm just talking. And when I'm talking, I'm not actually doing anything, I'm just talking. So there's no sense of using my body, using my psyche, or the spiritual energies. There's no sense of function. There's just simply talking. And as I talk, I know myself enough. I know my memory, I know my knowledge. I know enough as I'm talking, you might say, to shape the language. As I'm talking, I shape the language. Now, if you're a painter like Pablo Picasso and you're in the studio and you've got a blank canvas, right, a blank canvas, then as he puts the first colour, if he puts a line of red, then he puts a line of blue, there's a tacit understanding in his own consciousness that he knows what he's doing. It's like learning to ride a bike. Once you ride a bike, once you learn to ride a bike, when you're riding the bike, you're not thinking of the mechanism of riding the bike. And when you're able to ride the bike, you can go somewhere. So Picasso, with his sense of freedom of mind, his sense of genius, his sense of creativity, he's able to go somewhere because he knows what he's doing. And I'm saying now, as I'm talking, I know what to do because I know myself. And I know myself spiritually, I know myself psychically, and I know myself physically. So I know what I'm doing. So I don't need to think about the mechanism of how that's done. I just can do it. So my eyes can, I look out and I see it's autumn at the moment. The birch trees are a lovely yellow, a kind of mustard yellow, quite bright. The castle has a kind of golden coloured stone, and it's a very grey, misty sky, slightly raining, very misty. So I'm just looking at that scene. I've been here for for 18 years, and I look out the window during the day and during the evening because I have no curtains. So I'm looking out this very big window, and I've got a very good view of the park and the castle and the sky. So I see the stars, etc. What my psyche is doing, what my consciousness is doing in terms of language, you might say, I don't need to be aware of my psyche consciousness. So I'm aware of my body looking out of the window. I'm aware of the emptiness of nirvana, enlightenment. But when I'm talking, I'm not aware of my psyche consciousness. So it's almost like the spiritual and the physical, you might say, are really what's evident, and consciousness is not. And I mean psyche as well, you know, where you dream and you have imagination and you can astral travel, all the altered states. So I'm not in an altered state. So you could say consciousness and psyche is a kind of altered state. So I don't need to be in an altered state. So when I look out at the sky, the light in the sky, which is a vast space, so it's quite a big space I'm looking at. From a spiritual perspective, the emptiness of nirvana is very much like that space, that light in the space, but it has no definable characteristic. It's simply empty. But spiritually, you know it's there, you know it's a fact. You know it's a fact, but you can't define it other than say it's emptiness. That's the common term in Buddhism, is just simply shunyata, emptiness. Now I know that as a fact, so I don't have to question it, I don't have to doubt it, I don't have to worry about other people's opinion, I don't have to worry about what the Buddhists say. I'm confident in myself that I know that as a fact. So if I say, you know, shunyata, nirvana, samadhi, satori, etc., it doesn't make any difference to me what term is used. So this empty space is I'm using the word space because the one mind, as it were, the spiritual perception, the one mind, seems to be well, imagine the scene I'm looking at, the sky, the trees, the building, through, you know, just the sensory perception. That sensory perception, now imagine a different kind of light shining in the background, so you can't see it, but it's shining in the background. It's an invisible light that lights up everything in this sensory space. So you take the physical space, it can be the sky, it can be the stars, the actual physical space. Now this invisible light lights all of that up in the one mind. So the light of the mind is a different kind of space. It's an invisible space, but it's very, very real. And that openness is a sense of freedom. It's like the mind is free and consciousness is not free. So whatever consciousness does with its content, its knowledge, it can invent a kind of freedom in what it does, painting pictures, travelling, going into deep psychological depth in the psyche, astral travelling, putting a man on the moon, all the things science does in the quantum field, going right down to the unified field theory, the string theory of multi-dimensions and infinite universe, all of that kind of expansion of consciousness in the psyche and in the world is a kind of freedom, but that's not freedom for the human being. That's not the actual fact of freedom for the human being. And once you understand what freedom is, then you can see what we're doing with our consciousness, our thought and our knowledge, what we're trying to do in finding freedom. We're trying to find the freedom through our consciousness by expanding it. But that space of the mind, that freedom of the mind, is already there, but it's right here now, here, and it's everywhere. So if you went to the moon, it's there. If you went to, in the psyche, it's there. If you went to another dimension, if you went to another universe, that emptiness, the one mind permeates and enfolds all of reality. As far as I can think theoretically, I imagine it to enfold all of reality. So the one mind is something in itself, and then you've got reality. Now, I don't know personally what Buddha experienced when he went into the transcendental level of nirvana, when he left his body. I haven't left my body. I've never had an out of the body. I've never astral travelled or anything like that. I've just had some dreams and visions, but nothing more. I think there is a transcendental aspect of the one mind, and I think if you were to go there, like the Buddha, I think that one mind would be something in itself. It would exist in its own right. But when you're in a body and you're in your psyche and you're astral travelling, you're in the context of reality. So your experience, you might say, or your awareness, because the one mind is not an experience of reality. Reality is the experience of things as a totality, but the one mind is simply self-evident and is not an experience because it has no context, it has no relationship, it has no process that we know about. So as I sit here, the fact of the one mind is, you might say, ever present, as it were, and yet I'm looking at the world with my senses, or I might be thinking using my consciousness. So obviously I can't separate the one mind from the body and the psyche unless I went somewhere else, unless I went into some objective transcendental level, which I believe is there, but I haven't done that. So if somebody came to see me with expectations, what they've read and what they've heard, and they asked my advice on what to do, like Krishnamurti, he would say, observe thought, see the nature of consciousness, that it's bounded, it's under the control of the ego, and the ego is the self, and you have to go beyond consciousness and the ego through observing the nature of thought, observing the nature of the observer observed, and seeing the whole process of consciousness as a kind of self-deception, psychologically speaking, etc. And then you might say, then you move into the realm of the mind, universal mind, cosmic mind, whatever. I would say all of that is totally unnecessary. So I would say, in communicating to another person, I wouldn't use any form of analysis, any form of observation, any form of thought, consciousness, language. I wouldn't use any of those, any of that technique, conceptual way of thinking or anything like that. So if I'm with another person and they wanted to know how this came about for me, and I would say self-awareness came about naturally. It just came about naturally. And I use the term self-awareness. The Zen say the self-nature, which is the same thing. So Buddhahood, Nirvana, they say is self. And you find that in Vedanta, Upanishads, the self. You are yourself. Self is spiritual, the self is in the one, the self is enlightened. So I would say the natural sense of self of every human being on this planet, it is the self-nature of that, of each person, is really what matters. To be aware of this, that the self-nature is self-evident. That means at any moment you can become self-aware, because the fact of the one is right here now. So even before I was self-aware at the age of 23, that fact of the one, that fact of the one mind, is literally the fact of being a human being. So with the human being comes the body, the psyche, and the spirit. So they're together now in every human being. So I'm not talking about something beyond death, something beyond the body, something beyond the psyche. I'm not talking metaphysics in terms of transcendental wisdom, nirvana. I'm talking about what the reality in which everybody lives. So up until 23, I just lived my life as the people around me, my family, and you live and you die. There was no religious background, there's no religious belief. And in a secular, scientific type of society, you know, you just live your life. Now, as a child growing up, I think I did have a strong sense of myself as distinct from my ego or identity. But I didn't know that. I couldn't make the distinction between ego, identity and self because I didn't have the language to think that. So I couldn't have known it because I didn't have the language to think that. But on reflection, I think I never had a problem in the world, in my family, with my friends growing up, going to high school, going to university, etc. I don't think I ever had a problem with my ego identity in relationship to the world. I was never self-conscious, which I think is an indication of the ego identity and conscious. I think the ego is self-conscious. whereas I never felt self-conscious. And so you could say when the shift of consciousness took place, when I became aware of myself as distinct from my identity ego, that felt very natural. It wasn't, let's put it this way, the actual shift was traumatic. For me personally, was traumatic. I don't know why, but it was traumatic. And I think the trauma was simply the reaction of consciousness, of identity, of ego to that shift. Now, if you think of the psychology of consciousness, then obviously we all feel fear, we all feel a sense of self-protection in the world. So each person has fundamentally a conditioned psychology in relationship to the world. So when I was a student, I tried to do this and that, and I was identified with being a student, and I had a relationship with a girl, and things were complicated at times, etc. So I had all the normal psychological involvement in the world, and I was just functioning as an identity, an ego identity, and I think when that shift came about, there was naturally a psychological reaction to that shift. And it was traumatic, it was quite psychotic for a few weeks, and then when that ended, I just felt totally natural. I felt very liberated, I felt a tremendous sense of freedom. But because I'd never read any spiritual books, I didn't know it was a shift of consciousness. I didn't know it had anything to do with spirituality or enlightenment whatsoever. But once I started reading books within a year that showed me that it was a form of enlightenment and nirvana, when I read a book on Tibetan mysticism, then I knew that had taken place. And from that moment on, as it were, I just functioned from myself. And I had no problem with identity in the world and consciousness. I just read the books and I just did what I did as I normally did. Only now I was self-aware. That was the only change. I was just self-aware. I felt the freedom. I felt enlightened. And that was it. I mean, there's nothing more to be said. And then I became involved with Krishnamurti, listening to what he said, but none of what he said actually meant anything to me. I enjoyed going to the school, I enjoyed mixing with the people and listening to him and David Bohm, and I attended the conferences at Brockwood Park, Hampshire, England, from 71 to 85, the year before his death. And as I say, I enjoyed being there, I enjoyed listening to him, I enjoyed that. But the language, the analysis, everything he said, all the knowledge he was transmitting meant absolutely nothing to me. I didn't need to hear it, I didn't need to know it. And that became apparent at the very first talk. So when I was in the marquee, in the tent, listening to him, I didn't need to hear any of that, because I was already self-aware. But because he was an authority, because he was a much older person, he in his 80s, and I was 23, about 24, obviously I didn't have the confidence to think, well, maybe I'm a spiritual teacher, no, I'm enlightened, maybe I could do that. But I never did do that, and I never compared myself to Krishnamurti, and I did have contact with Krishnamurti, and I did have certain experiences in regard to Krishnamurti that revealed to me certain states of mind that he was in. So I experienced very similar states of mind through contact, literal contact with Krishnamurti. So I do have some understanding of what Krishnamurti is talking about when he refers to his own states of mind, what he calls universal mind. Krishnamurti uses quite a similar language that I might use to describe my condition, but my feeling is that if Krishnamurti was truly in the state of emptiness, if he was truly in that state of emptiness, he would not talk. He would not have talked the way he talked. Those who know do not tell, those who tell do not know. In the state of emptiness, there is really nothing to say. There's nothing to transmit. There's nothing to teach. That doesn't mean to say you can't talk about the condition you're in. You can't talk about the nature of spirituality, but there's no means of transmission through language. That's the first thing I disagree with his perspective. So my assumption is, I don't think he was in this emptiness as a fact. I don't think he was objectively in this emptiness. Because all of that self-observation is unnecessary. In fact, it's erroneous. It's just another trick. It's just another, you might say, dissociation of consciousness. And you might think, well, why did he spend 30 years developing that language, developing that observation? I think because he was in ignorance of this emptiness. I think it was because he had a certain role as a world teacher. There was a sense that when he was discovered by the Theosophists as a world teacher, as the Bodhisattva Maitreya, etc., I think when he left the Theosophists, he still had that image of himself. He still had a kind of power structure that he had. He had a large following. There was money there. He set up all these schools. And I think he was just living out the role of a world teacher, and more or less assuming that he was the only one in the state of mind that he was in. And he disregarded everybody from the past. He never referred to anybody in the past as having achieved the same level as he had achieved, or discovered the same level. Whereas I would say there are many people that have experienced emptiness and nirvana, and especially the Buddha. But I would say there are many people that have experienced that, and maybe now, today, there are many people, whether they're known or not known. So I think it's not simply one person in isolation that has this awareness. So I would say with Krishnamurti, it's very interesting that he uses the language of Buddhism and the East to describe various processes, but in the end, I think, from the way he tried to transmit this knowledge, I think that is a giveaway that he didn't have the simplicity of that emptiness in which knowledge would not be the means of communicating this to other people. he does say with David Bohm is very fascinating. It's very interesting to listen and see how these two people are trying to work out something that's very, very simple, and yet they make it so complicated, so complex, so intellectual. And I think, as it said about the Buddha, when he was with his friends and family, he held up a flower, and in holding up the flower, one of his friends was enlightened. So if you take the flower to be a symbol of life, and the life to be the one mind, the breath of the spirit, the life to be the one mind, then whatever went on between the Buddha and his cousin Ananda and one of his friends to bring about the Enlightenment, you could say it wasn't the person Buddha, it wasn't the friend Buddha, it wasn't the family member, the Buddha, the identity of their friend and family member, but it was simply something that happened through the mind doing whatever it does. So the mind came into my life and did whatever it did. It did it in its own way. And so you could say that the mind, the one mind of the Buddha, as it were, did its own thing. And because there is no personality, there's no identity in the one mind, it's simply yourself, what they call the Buddha essence. So there's no function, there's no process of transmission, so it simply means that the mind did what it did. It's purely natural. And that's why it's freedom. If the one mind's freedom, then by implication it can possibly free an individual or free the self from consciousness. It can produce that effect. So I'd say it's a total waste of time to try to do anything in any form of meditation, in any form of analysis, in any form of language and knowledge. It's a total waste of time. But again, that doesn't mean to say you can't talk about spirituality. There's nothing I can do for another person, because I'm not in control of the mind, as it were. Yes, you're in control of the language, like Krishnamurti and Bohm. They're in control of the language. Their ego identity can manipulate and control language, but it's still the ego identity doing that. That's the point. It's not the self doing that, because the self doesn't utilize consciousness in order to relate to another person. The self doesn't utilize memory, consciousness, knowledge. It wouldn't do that. That's my point of view. So if you look at the world as a whole, and I'm saying the one is right here now, it's always been here with the human being from the conception of the first human beings. The spirit psyche and body are together. So the mind has always been here, and it does what it does. I mean, it could be bringing about effects in consciousness and the body that we don't know about, and certain things that happen within culture, within science and music and art, what we call genius, that could be awakened by the mind, the one mind, the intelligence of the one mind. That intelligence could be responsible for heightened perception, insight, love, understanding, compassion, all the higher virtues, all the qualities of spiritual perception. That is what I think the one is doing in the world, is here because that's what it does. It's like a magnetic effect on the body and the psyche. It's like a magnetic effect. And I think that magnetic effect is a form of synchronicity. So there's a kind of synchronicity between the one mind and the body and the psyche, or the physical universe and the psyche. So it's purely natural. It's got and consciousness, memory, knowledge, ego, identity, the scientist, the psychologist, the religious person, the meditator can do nothing about it. There's no access through consciousness, so you can do absolutely nothing about it. And it's the ignorance of, say, our education, the way we think. It's our ignorance in understanding how genius and heightened perception, insight, intelligence works in culture. It's our ignorance of the one mind, which means we're in ignorance of what's bringing that about, what's bringing about the sense of love and compassion and truth and justice in the world, in terms of transforming disorder into order, or insanity into sanity. Yes, I mean people on an everyday level in politics and medicine and psychology, all the different fields of culture and knowledge. Yes, we're doing our best to use our identity, use our knowledge, use our experience in building an understanding of how the human being functions up to a point. But really, that which is really the essence of that understanding, the essence of that insight into the nature of reality psychophysically, the nature of the quantum, the nature of music, the essence of music, the essence of literature, I feel it is the one, the intelligence, the spiritual perceptions of love and truth. That's what's actually bringing that about. But of course we've got to do what we can do in our consciousness to reach towards understanding, but it's the one mind, the spiritual perceptions, that actually bring that about as a gift. So they do talk about the emanations of the spiritual dimension, the emanations called gift waves or grace waves, which again might relate to the magnetic nature of the one mind working in coincidence or synchronicity with the psyche and the body. And in turn, when we make gifts of ourselves to other people, we make gifts of our qualities, we make gifts of our intelligence, we make gifts of our love and affection and understanding and justice and ethics. We're mirroring the gift of the mind, the one mind, to the human being. And all of that's going on in every human being. Only we don't know it, just like we don't know how the Big Bang began. We don't know lots of things, so we don't necessarily know our spiritual nature or recognize or understand how it functions and what's going on.